Started. Today's daf in Masechet Nazir is daf Yud Tet 19. And I think he said he got to the top of the page, right? Is that correct? You're there. Okay. So I was about to check. But so it's a smack in the middle of a sugya, and I'll try to give a little background because it is pretty confusing as Masechet Nazir has gotten to be so far, though hopefully we'll simplify it a little today. But the basic question that we're dealing with is what the Torah seems to deal with in pretty extensive detail, is what if a person becomes a Nazir and then they become Tameh, right? So then the Torah describes, you bring a carbon, and it describes what carbon you bring and when you bring it. There's a lot of repetitive psukim, which is what we darshaned yesterday. It says you bring it by Yom Hahu, it already said which day. So we discussed that extensively yesterday, about what happens in terms of what happens next, right? You do your karban, then you have to start your nazirut again, right? And there's some situations in which you start over from the beginning, you do the whole thing again. And there's some situations in which you just pick up where you left off. So if you were going to be a nazir for 30 days and you had done 15 days and then you became tameh, you might become tahar 7 days later and then pick up from where you stopped. And we're going to discuss actually later in the 7th parak which cases apply in which scenarios. But the question that we dealt with yesterday and we'll again deal with is, what if you become tameh again during the time before you've brought your karban, right? So you become tameh, you're a nazir, right? You become tameh, say on day 20, and then you go ahead and you wait your 7 days to become tahar, and then at the end of that period, it's time to bring your karban. When does it start over, right? So when does your nazirut start, and which 7th day, the 8th day, which karban is necessary? And we had a machloket at the end of the day yesterday about whether the karban that the person brings, remember there's a chatat and an ola, there's also an asham, whether the ola is ma'akev. The Chachamim's opinion was that it's not, that the ola doesn't matter because the ola is just a doran, it's just a gift, basically. You know, it's not essential to the kapara, to the forgiveness. And the machloket was whether that's true or not. Rabbi Shmuel said it does matter. So today's the Gemara has, to try to clarify that machloket, which is where I think we're going to start, is the 4th line from the top of Yotet Amud Aleph, right? Where it says Mantana, Lahadetanu Rabbanan. Who is the author of the following Braita? The Braita has a very interesting case, which actually combines this Masechet with our last Masechet. The Tanu Rabbanan says the Braita on the 4th line of Daf Yotet Amud Aleph, Isha shenadra bin Nazir. A woman makes a neder that she's going to be a Nazir. Remember, a Nazir is a type of neder. Her husband, as we recall, and we learned extensively, has the ability to be mefer her neder. The woman makes a neder to be a Nazira. She goes along, say, for 10 or 15 days, and then it's ma'ah, and then she becomes tameh. So any Nazir who becomes tameh has to go bring a karban. But then, achar kach hefir leba'ala. Her husband didn't hear about it, obviously, because remember, you can only be mefer on the day he hears about it. She went to her husband and said, I need some money to buy a karban. He said, why do you need a karban? And she said, because I'm a Nazir and I'm tameh. And he said, that's a terrible idea. And he was made for her nazirut, right? Achar kach mefir la ba'ala. Says the Braita, what does she do then? So mevi'ah chatata of. She should continue. She'd already it's not so clear if she'd already separated the bird or not, but she should bring the chatata of. But eino mevi'ah olata of. She should bring the bird that's the chatat, but not the bird that's an ola. Now, the question is why, right? So the Gemara is assuming, says Rav Chisda, this must be Rabbi Shmuel. This must be Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel said yesterday that the ola is essential. Chachamim said the ola is really non-essential. So the way the Mefarish here, in Rashi's spot explains it, is that according to the Chachamim, obviously you don't bring the Ola. The Ola is sort of unessential. So if there's any doubt, throw out the Ola. But according to Rabbi Shmuel, you would have thought that since the Ola is essential, you bring it, and therefore the Chiddush here is that you don't. But the reason that the fact that we had to tell you that only makes sense according to Rabbi Shmuel. Tosfos has the opposite approach, but let's read that for now. Maybe we'll add Tosfos in a little bit. So this is Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel usually says that the Ola is necessary. In this case, because there's some doubt about whether she should do it or not, the Ola is not brought. Okay, that's how we understand. Now says Gemara, I don't get it. Micah suffer. What exactly do you think about the big picture? Meaning, what exactly is this woman chayiv to bring? Is she a Nazira or not a Nazira? right? Why doesn't she bring both? Or why doesn't she bring none of them? So Ika Savar, remember, there was two ways to approach this. We discussed this in Masechet Nidarim, but there's one opinion is that Baal mi akar, is that when the husband is made for her neder, it uproots it from ever happening. Like when a chacham would be matir a neder, right? A person made a neder, chacham says you don't have to do it. The whole thing is thrown out. So here too, when a woman says, makes a neder or nazir here, and the husband is mefer, what happens? So there's one opinion that the Baal is akar. He uproots the entire neder, in which case there's no carbon. She was never a nazir. She was never a nazir who became tamei, and so there's nothing to bring. So chatat of nami lo laiti. She shouldn't bring any chatat. But ika savar Baal megas gayas, if you're of the opinion that when a husband is made for a neder, he cuts it off, meaning so from the time he hears about it and he cancels it, it no longer has effect. But in the past, it was effective, and she was a nazira, and she became tamei. If that's true, ola tov nami laiti. She should bring an ola also. So I don't understand whatever you're saying. Is she a nazira or not? Right? Did the husband cancel it or not? It says where it must be, obviously, the olam kasavar, it must be at the Tana holds Baal me akar. That in fact, the husband uprooted the neder from the beginning. So she was never a nazira. So if she's never a nazira, so why would she bring a chatat ta'of, right? Why would she?
I've got a worse one. Yeah, she goes ahead and brings the chatat and viola before the husband can uproot it. So she retroactively has actually brought chulin korbanot and put them on the altar.
Right, it's true. And that could happen by, I think presumably the Kohanim might say to her, does your husband know about this? But yeah, but conceivably that could happen. It could happen with Hatara also, by the way, right?
Yeah.
You could be mati your neder. You didn't realize how severe this was or whatever, but it's true. That's why these nidarim get very tricky. Says well, it's really they hold the husband is me'akar akar. So why is she bringing a chatat off? There's no nazir here. Rabbi Yishmael savrlak Reb Elazar Kippar. Rabbi Yishmael holds like the opinion that we've quoted many, many times, and we'll continue to quote of Rabbi Elazar HaKippar, the Tanya Rabbi Elazar HaKippar Birebi Omer. Why does the Torah say that this is an interesting pasuk, but it's in reference to a woman or a man, anyone who's a Nazir or Nazira, who becomes Tameh. They bring the karbanot, and the pasuk says to kiper alav. These karbanot will be a kapara on him. Me'asher chata al hanefesh, for sinning on a soul. Ask Rabbi Elazar Kippar, what's the language? A chata al nefesh. Be'ezeh nefesh chata. What nefesh did you sin on? Ella chatazeh, ella shetzier atzmo min hayayin. This is referring to every Nazir, because a Nazir, by definition, deprives himself. That's what being a Nazir is. You're not drinking wine. You're not doing behaviors that, remember, we talked earlier about, it's considered to be a good thing for some people to be metamei lemeitim, because then someone will take care of them if they take care of other people, remember? So you're being mitzayer yourself. So, and kal v'chomer. A person who only separated them, this is Rabbi Elazar Kippar's comment, from wine, is called a sinner. Right? If you deprive yourself of everything, I mean, you don't enjoy the good things in life, then you're certainly a sinner. And so therefore, this woman, although she's not really a Nazir, she did behave in a way that deprived herself. And so she essentially accomplished part of what a Nazir accomplishes, and therefore we allow her to bring her chatat because she essentially sinned. Now, of course, everyone points out that you can't just bring a carbon because it sounds nice, right? And so we've mentioned many times that the chatat ta'of is the exception to almost all carbonot, because none of the chatat ta'of goes on the mizbeach. They do malika, they throw it in the deshen, nothing goes on the mizbeach. So you can bring a chatat ta'of misafek. It's the only carbon that we bring misafek, because you don't end up bringing anything on the mizbeach anyway. So if it turns out to have been chulin, it's not a big deal. And so that's why she's able to bring it. Says the Gemara, that's a very nice drasha from Elazar Kippar, but this has been Nazar Tamei Ktiv. This pasuk is referring to a Nazir who became Tamei, not referring to every Nazir. It doesn't say that every Nazir is Chata al Nefesh. It says a Nazir who was a Nazir and then became Tamei is Chata al Nefesh. Anana filo Nazir Tahar Kamina. We're talking even by a Nazir Tahar. We say that they're a Chotei. Says the Gemara, no, that's what Rabbi Elazar Kippar holds. Kasav Rabbi Elazar Kippar, Nazir Tahar Nami Chotehu. Even a Nazir who committed to this and went through the whole process and fulfilled it and didn't make any mistakes along the way, there's an aspect of sin involved in that too. The reason the Torah says that teaching by a Nazir who's tamei is because that person's particularly poor, because not only did they make Nazirut, which is a bad idea, then they didn't even keep it, right? So it's one thing to overreach. It's second thing to overreach and then not fulfill what you said you were going to do. And so that's a particular sin. But in fact, Rabbi Elazar Kipar is of the opinion that every Nazir involves an aspect of sin because it's not the way it's supposed to be. You're not supposed to deprive yourself of things that the Torah allows. Now, we're at the 2 dots now, 10 lines from the bottom. So I'm going to go back to the Mishnah because the Mishnah was very confusing. And I don't know what everyone learned when they read the Mishnah, if they all learned the Gemara, but otherwise it's really hard to read the Mishnah. Find it. The Mishnah is on Tet Zayin Amud Bet. And the Mishnah basically said a person became a Nazir and they were in a Beit HaKfarot, right? So they said they were sitting in a cemetery and they said, I want to be a Nazir. Now, of course, they're Tameh. So the Nazirut doesn't start. So basically, you've got to leave the cemetery, become Tahar 7 days later, and then your Nazirut starts, right? So we said in the Mishnah, a very interesting din, which is that if you were a Nazir outside and your Nazirut started, and you went 15 days, and then you walked into a cemetery, your Nazirut would pause while you're Tameh. Once you became Tahar, you would continue your Nazirut from day 15, right? But so you basically would get credit essentially for the time you already did. But since in this case you started in the Beit HaKfarot, there's nothing to give you credit for because that's where you started, right? So then the Mishnah said, now this is what our 2 dots says, Yatsa v'nichnas, if you leave the cemetery, but then you go back in, olin lo min haminyan. Then the days that you are outside count for your Nazirut. That's the one that implies that we want you to go back into the cemetery, which is a pretty bad idea if you're a Nazir, right? Katani olin lo min haminyan mishum di yatsa chal alav Nazirut. Says Gemara, how could it be that they count once you left your Nazirut should be chal? Amar Shmo kigon sheyatsa v'hiza v'shana v'tava, right? It's talking about a case where you didn't walk out of the cemetery. You walked out of the cemetery. You were 7 days basically of tahara for a tumat mate, right? You get hazaya. You get sprinkled with the water of the para duma on day 3 and day 7, and then you went to the mikvah, and then you kept a few days, and then you went back into the cemetery. So those days count. So why are we talking about a case where you went back in? It's saying if you go back into the cemetery, it counts. Right? If you didn't go back in, it doesn't count. Obviously, it can't be, right? Meaning, if you kept your Nazirut, it counts as Nazirut. Says Lomi Boy Kamar. It's telling you even in this case, Lomi Boy Yatsa. Not only if you left the cemetery and did everything right, that now you're a good Nazir. Ela afilu nichnas. Even if you went back in after 15 days, olin lo min haminyan. Those days count because once you have left and started your Nazirut, going back into the cemetery does not cancel your Nazirut. Now remember, we're going to talk later that going to the cemetery does not cancel it, but being tamei to a mate does cancel it. So if you touch a dead body, it will cancel your Nazirut, as the Torah says. But certain actions like avir and cemeteries or ohel and things like that don't cancel your Nazirut. Amrle Rav Kahana.
If you were like in a house that was tamei or something like that.
So you don't. Well, it's a whole Mishnah later in the 7th parak, but ohel is not. There's a list in the Mishnah of what's mitamei and what's not, what cancels and what doesn't cancel. The short version, though we'll get into it a lot later, is that touching a dead body or a part of a dead body cancels, but being in this airspace in ohel doesn't cancel.
You're not tamei, or
you are tamei? No, you're certainly tamei. You're tamei mate, and you've got to stop your Nazirut basically, and you have to become tahar. And remember, we discussed that while you are stopped your Nazirut, you still have to observe all the things. You can't drink wine, you can't get a haircut, and you can't become tamei again. But that's called Nazir Tamei, is what we called it, right? You're in between sort of status, but it doesn't cancel your earlier days, and you don't bring a karban. So you just do your 7 days of tahara, and then you start over your Nazirut. Not start over, sorry. You continue your Nazirut.
Right.
But if you touched a dead body, and we'll see all the cases later, then you not only have to do 7 days of tahara, you then have to bring a karban, for your Nazirut and start all over from the beginning. Okay. Now, says Rav Kahana Rav Asi the Rav, it's a very funny statement. They said to Rav, my time in Lafrachidon Kahalan Milan. We, Rav Kahana and Rav Asi were students of Rav. Everyone was talking about Shmuel's explanation for our Mishnah, which is so beautiful. And Rav and Shmuel, as you know, were contemporaries, we'll say, or adversaries maybe, but they ran competing yeshivot in Bavel. And so the students of Rav said, how come you never tell us such good explanations? We learned this Mishnah and we never heard this from you. Amar Alon, he said to them, because I thought maybe you were smart enough to figure it out. Amina, Dilma lo tzrichuta. Maybe you guys had brains on your shoulders. I thought maybe you would figure this out. I don't need to spoon feed you everything like in Shmuel's yeshiva, right? So I wanted to give you a challenge, but maybe this generation's not up to it. I don't know. So that was the funny comment between Rav and
Hadara.
Exactly. Continued the Mishnah, a very, very unusual halacha of Reb Eliezer, where Reb Eliezer said, interestingly, that a person who never started their Nazirut never brings a karban for being a Nazir, right? So again, you commit to being a Nazir, 10 days pass, and you touch a dead body, right? Let's just say. Then you stop your Nazirut, you are tameh for 7 days, you bring a karban, and you start all over from the beginning. But if you never started your Nazirut, meaning on day 0, day 1 we'll call it, you were in a cemetery, you said, I want to be a Nazir, right? So it doesn't start until you leave the cemetery and become tahar. And then you touch a dead body, you don't bring a karban because it never started, right? And the Mishnah and the pasuk says that only basically if your Nazirut started, does the Tumah cancel it, okay? Said Rebbe Eliezer, not only does it have to start, but it has to get to day 2. Right? Meaning, if you started on Monday morning in your own house and said, I'm a Nazir, and then Monday evening you touch the dead body, you don't bring a karban, right? Rebbe Eliezer said that it has to be day 2. Now, Rebbe Eliezer Omer, lo bo bayom, not if you become tameh on the first day. Shenemar, because the pasuk says, hayamim harishonim yiplu. The earlier days are thrown away, implying you had to have days. If it was day 1, then the pasuk doesn't apply. Yamim rishonim, until there's plural days. Now, Amar Ula said Ula, lo Amar Rebbe Eliezer al b'tamei Nazar. Rebbe Eliezer was only talking about a case like I just spoke about, where a person's in a cemetery and they commit to being a Nazir. Then, once they become tahar, if days have not passed, they don't have to bring a karban if they become tamei again. Aval bin Nazir tahar shenitma. But if you were tahar at the time you made your Nazirut, then afilu yom echad soter. Even if you did it day 1, became tameh, you'd have to bring a karban. That's what Rabbi Eliezer said, right? Who was it? Ula, sorry, that's what Ula said. Amar Rava, now said Rava, my time with Rabbi Eliezer. What would be the reason for Rabbi Eliezer? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Amar Kra ki tameh nizro. It's talking about a case where you were tameh when you made the Nazirut. That's how we're dashing it. Of course, it's not what it literally means. What it literally means is that you made your Nazirut tameh. But by reading it this way, you could read it mishum de bitumah nazar. You were tameh when you made your Nazirut. So in that case, you never cancel and bring a karban unless you had a period where you were tahar. The whole thing started for 1 day, and then on day 2 you became tameh. But if you made a Nazirut in the morning and you were tahar when you started, even if you became tameh that same day, you would have to bring a karban, according to Rebbe Eliezer. That's what Ula says. Says Abaya, Ula, you're wrong. Eitfei Abaya. Ask Abaya, and we're going to say that Ula is wrong. Ask Abaya from the following Braita. 3 lines down now from Yud Tet Amud Bet. Hareini Nazir Mea Yom. Person says, I'm going to be a Nazir for 100 days, says the Braita. V'nitzma b'tchilat Mea. He becomes Tameh on day 1. He couldn't make it through 1 day, right? So you might think, Yachol Yehes Soter. You might think that this cancels. Now, of course, it does cancel in the sense that you have to do another 100 days. But the point is, you don't have to bring a karban, right? You might think that you would have to bring a karban, Talmud Lomar, that you don't. Hayamim harishonim yiplu. It says the earlier days have to be canceled by your tumah, ad sheyulo yamim rishonim, until you have plural days in the beginning. V'zeh ein lo rishonim. You don't have days in the beginning. You only had 1 day. So therefore, you do not bring a karban. Of course, this is the opinion of Rebbe Eliezer, right? Continues the Braita. Now, just to point out, the Gemara is going to say it later. But obviously, this shows that Ula is wrong, right? Because Ula said the only case where Rebbe Eliezer said it is if you were tamei when you became a Nazir. And this Braita speaks nothing about being tamei when you became a Nazir. It just says you woke up in the morning and said, I'll be a Nazir for 100 days. So we're going to say that at the end of the Braita. But this clearly proves Ula wrong, right? That Rebbe Eliezer would apply to every case of Nazirut. If you're a Nazir, no matter how long you're a Nazir for, if it's the day one and you become tamei, it doesn't have the same rules of bringing the karban that other tuma of a Nazir would have. Let's keep reading the Braita though. Where am I? Nitma besof me'ah. This is very interesting. Let's say you became tamei on the last day. You make it through 100 days of Nazirut, and day 100 you become tamei. Unfortunately, yachol yeh soter. So you might think that this cancels everything, and again that you have to do it over and bring a karban. Talmud lomer v'hayamim harishonim yiplu. That the earlier days fall off, and what he's darshaning here is michlal diika achronim. When you say that the earlier days, you imply that some of the Nazirut was canceled. But if you're on the last day and you canceled it, it would be all of the Nazirut. It would not be Yamim HaRishonim. It would be all the Yamim. And therefore, this rule does not apply to the last day of the Nazirut. Now, just to remind you, okay? Now, just to remind you, there's a separate rule that we discussed last Shabbos, actually, last Motzaei Shabbat, that if you become Tamei on Yom Milot, on the last day of a Nazirut, which is what day 100 is, that you do a new 30-day Nazirut, remember, right? So that still would apply, presumably. The Rush talks about it here, right? So, but you don't have to do 100 days, and you don't have to bring a karban, according to this, because you only bring the karban if you canceled the beginning days, not if you canceled all the days. Now, nitma b'yom me'ah chaser echad, if you become tamei on day 99, or the way the Gemara says 100 minus 1, then you're messed up. Yachol lo yeh soter. You might have thought there's no problem. This is just rhetorical. Talmud lomer v'yamim harishnim yiplu michlal diika achronim. All you have to fulfill is the first days are canceled. There has to just be some time left. V'zeh yesh lo rishonim v'achronim. This case, there's earlier days because you did 99, and there's one more day left. Now, that's the Braita. And says the Gemara, the reason this proves that Ula is wrong is you can't say this is referring to a case of a Tamei who became a Nazir, because it says, Hareini Nazir Me'ah. Person says, I'm going to be a Nazir for 100 days. They became Tamei on day one. So clearly they weren't already Tamei, right? So clearly the cases where they were Tahar and they became Tamei, and it still says, the Katani ad lo yamim rishonim, that you don't cancel it unless you have earlier days. Tiyufta, this in fact proves that Ula is Ula is wrong, and that in fact Rebbe Eliezer holds that every Nazir who becomes Tamei only cancels the things and only has all the rules of the pasuk if they've already done some days b'tahara. Now, I've been very vague about what days mean, right? So day one is clearly not sufficient. But do you have to do 2 days to day 2 or to day 3? Meaning you have to finish Yamim Rishonim. Does that mean 2 days? And you become Tamei on day 3? Or does Yamim Rishonim mean by the second day, right? So that's unclear so far in the Gemara. And in fact, that's the next line. That's sort of a papa. I don't know where exactly how to say the spot, but probably around 15 lines down, the middle of the line. Amalei Rav Papa le'Abaya halin yamim dekamrinan. When you say that there has to be days, right? And the pasuk says days. It says yamim rishonim, the days. What do the days mean? The nafik chad umatchilin train, that one day has passed and you've started the second day. Odilma the nafkin train umatchilin tlata. Does it mean that you finished 2 full days b'tahara and you're up to the 3rd day? Lo havi biyade. So he didn't know the answer. Abaye was stumped. So just like we're all wondering, Abaye was also unclear of the answer. So Rav Papa didn't give up. Ata Shaile the Rava. He came and asked a question to Rava, who was also a contemporary, as we all know, Rava and Abaye. Amalei yipluktiv. Rava said, look, the pasuk says yiplu. Now, there's a machloket, of course, what this tells us, right? So from the context you'll see in the Gemara, it implies that yiplu means even part of the day. So yiplu means they basically started, essentially. So this would imply the beginning of or part of the second day. Doesn't have to be the full day, even miksat hayom. And says the Gemara, but it's also plural, by the way. Yiplu means, not one. Says the Gemara, it's sorry? The michtav yamim.
You're welcome.
It has to say plural days. V'itzrich the michtav yiplu. Dikatev rachmana yamim. If it just said the word yamim, that would imply full days. Lo katev yiplu. I would have thought have them mean again. This is our girsa ad nafkin train va'island tlata. The 2 full days have to pass until the 3rd day starts. So therefore, katuv rachmana yiplu, which implies even start of the day, even the beginning of the day. Or part of the day, I should say. The katav rachmana yiplu, v'lo katav yamim. I would have thought afilu chad, even when the first day started. Basically, that's part of the days, and therefore yiplu, although it's plural, is not referring to plural days, but plural nizirim, right, to everybody. So therefore, katav rachmana yamim, and so therefore, according to our Gemara, this is our girsa. It's yamim, and yamim yiplu tells you that part of the 2nd day. So the Nazir has to be tahar for the 1st day and become tamei during the 2nd day. The Rambam, just for context, disagrees and says he must have a different girsa, because obviously our Gemara wouldn't make any sense. And he learns the opposite, and he learns that according to Rabbi Eliezer, you need to be on the 3rd day. You actually need 2 full days of Nizirut in order for you to become susceptible to the Tumah of the Karban of the Tumah.
But a half day, a half day counts as a day, or a little bit of a day.
In this case, yeah. That's how our Gemara seems to go, and that's how we paskin. But yeah, sometime in the 2nd day. Continues the Mishnah. We have plenty of time here, so let's learn another Mishnah. Mishnah Nazar Nizirot Harbe. Let's say, now this Mishnah introduces a very interesting concept as well, which is a concept which we've talked about before. I'm trying to remember, probably in Erevin we talked about, but I don't recall the exact daf, which is called Tumat Eretz Ha'amim, right? The Chachamim made a principle, a decree, that anyone who's in land outside of the land of Israel, no, it's very debatable. I don't really know whether it means just outside the land of Israel or specific places. But that land that's outside, it's called Eretz Ha'amim, non-Israeli, they didn't call it Israel, right? Non-whatever, the kingdom, is by, you assume it's all Tameh. And there's a few reasons for that. So one potential reason, and this we're going to discuss it today, is that there's dead bodies everywhere. They assume that people are careless about how they bury outside of Israel, where we care about Tumah, and therefore you have to assume that wherever you live outside, that the land is strewn with bones, I guess, that underneath them. Either you touch them or you're in the ohel. So that's one assumption. The other possibility.
I have a problem with that. So this was probably true in the time of the Mishnah, but since then, the land of Israel has been invaded so many times by so many murderous armies. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Persians, the Muslims, the Crusaders, the Mongols, and then the Turks. That's probably true about the land of Israel too today.
So I completely agree with you, and obviously it's very complicated. So I'm just going to say the other point is that there's a takana, that's a gzera maybe, that they don't want you to go there, they want you to act that way. But I think
that would apply today, yeah.
But Charlie, part of it is not the fact that people were killed, because people were killed everywhere. I don't think that's, it's the carelessness maybe about Tumah, that if you don't really care about where you put the bodies and where you bury them, then it's liable that they could be somewhere, right? The question, of course, is let's say you clean it up. Let's say you clean a field, right? You could clean a field, or you could look, or you could dig or something. Would that change the reality, right? So that's where it gets complicated, where you make a takana on a whole land because you're worried about certain circumstances where you can't control it. So it's certainly a gezerah. It's not saying that you're definitely tamei, but it's saying that everyone, at least then, in Eretz Ha'amim, has to assume they're tamei mate, which means that if you live in, let's just use Baghdad for a moment, and you say, I want to be a Nazir, then you can't. You can't be, you can be a Nazir, but then if you come to Israel to bring your carbon, you can't bring your carbon because you have to assume that you were Tameh, in which case you got to start all over, right? So they made a takana, which now, if you never came to do your carbon, maybe it wouldn't be a problem, but you have to bring a carbon to get out of being a Nazir. So
except that you don't know whether you're Tameh mate or not.
So says let's read the Mishnah.
Okay.
Mishnah Nazar Nizirot Harbe. let's say a person made a Nizirut Harbe. Now, this is a funny language, but what it really means here is a long Nazir, not 30 days, but like say 100 days. Not many Nizirut, but a extended Nizirut, right? So the Hishlimet Niziruto, and you say 100 days, and you observe your 100 days in your home in Damascus or wherever, and then you come to Eretz Yisrael to bring your karban. V'achar kach ba la'eretz, Beit Shammai omrim Nazir 30 yom. You have to do another 30 days. So even though your original one was long, which is why we have that case, 100 days, let's say, basically, we'll see in the Gemara why, but let's just say, I'll speak it out. They made a takana that you should do a because we're afraid you're tamei from being outside, but we're not certain of it. So do 30 days, do a full Nizirut, Stam Nizirut in Israel, and then bring your karban. Ubeitil omrim Nazir b'tchila. You got to start all over. Whatever you committed to, you got to come to Israel and live in Israel, right? It's pretty good for tourism, I guess. You got to stay in Israel for 100 days and do your Nizirut. And in fact,
Hillel is stricter here.
yeah, it's true.
Is this appearing in Masechta Edyot?
Yeah, it's a mission idiot as well. It's one of the
Okay,
cases. It's one of the cases where Beit Hillel is stricter.
Right.
It is.
Maaseh, now very interesting story, which I think is very informative about the whole concept of Nazirut. The Maaseh b'Hilni Amalka. There was a story with Hilni Amalka. I don't have all the historical information about Hilni Amalka, but maybe Charlie does. Shahalach b'na l'nochama. Her son went to war, which sounds like the kind of thing a queen's son would do. The Amran, she was so nervous about him that she said, Im yavo b'ni min hamilchama b'shalom, ahei nazira sheva shanim. If my son comes back in healthy, in one piece, from this war, I will be a Nazirah for 7 years. So that was quite a commitment. And also, it's also very uncomfortable, right? It's this transactional nature of Nazirut, which is like, I'll do it. I'm not going to be a Nazir because I want God to protect my son. I'm making you a deal here, right? If my son gets back alive, then I'll be a Nazirah. But anyways, of course, her son came back, right? Son came home from war. So she said, okay, I'll fulfill my, the Rishonim say that she was Jewish. Let's go with that part. Okay. That she converted or something. I
just posted the Steinsaltz explanation.
Okay. Wow. I don't know if I could stop and read that whole thing, but okay. So
it's not short.
We'll read it.
Yeah,
after.
she converted together with her son. So
Okay.
the two of them converted.
Yeah.
Okay. So she converted. But so she was following the rules. So 7 years she was a Nazirah. Hayta Nazirah Sheva Shanim. Ubesov Sheva Shanim al Talar. So she finished her 7 years. She read the Chumash like everybody else and said, you got to come bring your karban. So she came to Israel to bring it. And of course, they said to her, well, it doesn't count what you did outside of Israel, right? Horu Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel told her, they paskin like Beit Hillel, Shtei Nazirah od Sheva Shanim Acherot. You got to stick around Israel and be a Nazirah for 7 more years. Again, I don't know the logistics. Ubesov Sheva Shanim Nitmeit. She then became Tameh in the last day of her 7 years. So Nimseit, she had to do 21 years. Nazirah Esrim Ve'achad Shana. It sounds like most of her life. So because of this one promise, she was a Nazirah for 21 years. Again, it's a very funny detail, like why we care, but maybe it's historical. And for 21 years, she was a Nazirah. Amr Rabbi Yehuda, I don't agree with that last detail. She was only Nazirah for 14 years. We'll see in the Gemara, is he arguing, which part is he arguing with? Is he passing like Beit Shammai and saying she doesn't have to do 7 years because of outside of Eretz Yisrael, but just do 7 years because she was Tameh? Or is he arguing in some other way? We'll see in the Gemara. Now, let's just do some of this Gemara. We'll get to the first 2 dots. Katani Reisha, which doesn't make a lot of sense either in this, and some take it out, right? Some say, Beit Shammai, the Reisha says, Beit Shammai says a person who's a Nazir outside of Eretz Yisrael and comes in is Nazir Shloshim Yom. They become a Nazir for 30 days. Beit Hillel says Nazir B'tchila, that they're more machmir. You got to repeat the whole Nazirut. What's the argument? Perhaps what they argue is about what's the reason that being outside of Eretz Yisrael is considered to be tameh. Lemas de Beit Shammai Savri Eretz Ha'amim Mishum Gusha Gazru Aleh, that they were gozer and Eretz Ha'amim outside of Israel Tumah because of Gusha. Gusha literally means a thing you touch, right? So we're basically afraid that anywhere you touch, you're going to touch a piece of a dead person, in which case you can certainly be careful. Now, this is one explanation. You
What
could be
does
careful
gusha
about that.
mean?
Gush is like a
How they
physical,
translating gusha?
as a piece, a thing you touch, an object.
Okay, as opposed to what?
Well, see the next one. Beit Hillel Savri, in top line in Chaf, Mishum Avira Gazrula. That in fact, what they were gozers Mishum Avira, that basically that instead of them saying there are pieces or things that you're touching everywhere, they made a takana that either the entire ground basically is covered with corpses, assuming, and so all of the airspace basically of Eretz Amim is tameh.
But
Now
that's
that's
not
one
an ohel.
explanation. Sorry,
That's not an ohel. The sky is above. It's ohel
Correct.
has to be a
correct.
enclosed covering or something,
So correct that they made a special. It's a special takana. So you talk about the Gemara talks about a case where let's say you were in a helicopter or a parachute kind of thing where you didn't walk to get into the place, but you went over the airspace basically. And so according to Beit Hillel, this is the way again the Mefarish understands it here. There's a special new tuma that they made up for Eretz Ha'amim that was not exist elsewhere. It was basically a new tuma because of how severe the tuma could be there, and therefore. Now, this is again the Mefarish understands it. According to Beit Shammai, this is standard tumah basically. And since you could be careful, you could know about it. It's really unlikely. They made a takana, but it's not very likely. According to Beit Hillel, because it's a new level of tumah, it's much more strict. And therefore, according to Beit Hillel, they wanted to start over as if you were tameh the whole time. According to Beit Shammai, it's almost symbolic, and you're doing an extra 30 days. So that might be the difference. Whether it's
all the Rabbanan though. How could they? I mean.
It doesn't matter. So that's a really good question. The Rishonim asked that. So what's your it's the Rabbanan. So we say just be a Nazir for 7 more years or 30 days or 90 days. The question that the Rishonim ask is that you're being over a prohibition of Bal Ta'acher. Remember, when you commit to bringing a karban, you're supposed to bring it right away. So essentially here you are delaying your karban because, as you said, of something Rabbanan. So the answer they give is that you're doing it passively. So you're not actively being over because you're just not bringing it, which is always the case, right? But that the Chachamim would have the power, even though they don't have the power to tell you to go against the Torah, they have the power to say passively to not fulfill something. But it is all, you are correct, it's all midrabanan. So that's what we think, that the Machloket is Beit Shammai says Mishum Gusha and Beit Hillel says Mishum Avir. Lo, says Gemara on top line, it's not really that simple. It's Kuliyama Mishum Gusha, Gazdrula, everyone agrees that the reason that you are considered to be tameh is because you might have touched something tameh, not because of this new air question. Beit Shammai Savri Bistam Nazirut Knisua. Look, the whole thing is Rabbanan. It's a knas. So the Rabbanan said do it over, but they didn't say do the whole thing over. Do a stam Nazirut. So even if you agree to do 100-day Nazirut, when you do your do over, do 30 days. Beit Hillel Savri Ki Knisua B'Tchilat Nazirut. The knas was that you should start all over. Now, just to be very clear, this has to assume that you already did the original Nazirut outside of Eretz Yisrael, right? You did the 100 days. Because if you didn't do the 100 days and you came to Israel, then you can't say just do 30 days, right? You didn't even fulfill your commitment. But we're talking about a case, which was the Mishnah's case, where you said, I'll do 100 days. You did 100 days, then you came to Israel. So there, Beit Shammai says, look, there's a knas, that it's as if you were tameh. But the knas only, going to Beit Hillel, it makes a lot of sense. You make a knas midrabanan, you say you're tameh, so act like you're tameh, and start all over again. According to Beit Shammai, because it's only midrabanan, the level of the extension of the knas was only to start over and do another 30 days.
You don't have to go to the mikveh or anything like that, or
Yeah, you do. When you get to Israel, you have to become tahor.
You have to.
Yeah. And that, just to be clear, we've talked about this before, but that's how they presumably treated everybody. Now, again, they didn't, I guess they didn't have that many people coming from Chutz La'aretz, or else this would have become pretty untenable, right? But that was the way it was treated, according to the Mishnah in the times of the Mishnah, of the Beit HaMikdash. We'll stop here. We'll tell the story of Hilni Amalka tomorrow morning. I think we have to meet tomorrow morning. I hope 7:45 work? Miriam can't make it, unfortunately.
I wouldn't make it anyway. I'm going to California tomorrow, so.
Oh, have a great
Oh,
trip.
wow.
What?
Water?
Enjoy.
Water?
Yeah.
Regards.
Regards.
Thank you.
Guards, we're sorry you can't make it. 7:45 a.m. I'll put it on the WhatsApp. I hope to see everyone who can make it tomorrow morning. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
Yasher Koach.
Good night.